Hey everybody, it's George, your Fanatic here, and I've got a very special guest here today. We've got he's a man of many talents here when it comes to writing. He's done wrestling books, he's done superhero, sci-fi, horror, action, all over the place here. Ladies and gentlemen, writer and author John Crowther, welcome to the show, sir.
Hey George, thanks for having me on tonight.
Thank you very much for coming here. I appreciate it. So, like I said, you've got, quite a lot of different genres under your belt, but of course, it seems like a very beloved genre of yours is wrestling.
Absolutely. Yeah, I grew up, a fan of wrestling ever since I was probably about 6 years old. I grew up here in Florida back in the territorial days.
Yeah.
To kind of date myself, I'm 50 now, so you can kind of figure that. So it was back during Eddie Graham's days with Championship Wrestling from Florida.
Yeah.
My great grandfather actually got me into it. I remember I'd get left over at his house, and he was a big Wahoo McDaniel fan, and he'd be jumping up, throwing fists at the television set. And when you're like a 6-year-old kid and you see your grandfather or great grandfather doing that, of course it gets you riled up too.
Yeah.
So ever since then, I just love professional wrestling.
Yeah, I discovered it through some friends at a slumber party. My very first show I ever saw was the episode of the Friday main event where the Mega Powers, Hogan and Savage, broke up.
Yeah,
So
okay.
that was my introduction to wrestling.
Yeah,
so
well, I can even remember when I first, we'd see stuff like for the WW, it was WWF, and then WWF, we'd see it in the magazines down here in Florida until they had, I think it was it Friday Night Main Event or Saturday Night?
Yeah, mostly it was Saturday nights they did.
Saturday Night Main Event, I'd see that come in, it was Channel 35, and you'd stay up late to kind of watch that. And that was really my first introduction to seeing Hulk Hogan live and then eventually the Macho Man and stuff like that. I mean, we'd see him in magazines, but to actually see them perform was something new.
Yeah, of course, I grew up in the Louisville area, and so we got kind of, a little bit of everything because basically when I was still a kid, we had a lot of Memphis wrestling around the area. So we got, the national stuff, but then that was considered the local wrestling was Memphis.
Yeah.
And then for a very short period of time, you had Angelo Paffo's organization out of Lexington. So, of course,
there you go.
His baby boy there, was part of that. So, and I worked in TV for a little bit, so I got to know a lot of people who worked at that station where they broadcast all that. So they're like, "Oh yeah," it's like we knew, all the Paffos pretty well.
That's cool. That's cool. And of course, everybody knew at the time, at least in my region, and probably yours too. WTBS at 6:05.
Oh yeah.
Live out of Atlanta, we'd turn that on and watch WCW. So that was, and the only way I didn't have cable. To be honest, my dad was. I grew up in a little town in Central Florida, and my father was the mayor actually. And I remember they wanted to bring cable television into our town, and they told my father and other members of the council that if you would let us put this cable in your city, we'll give you all free cable. Well, little did they know that was the last thing he wanted to say to my dad, because now my dad thought it was a bribe. Yeah. So my dad wouldn't allow. He said, no, we're not getting it. So we didn't end up having cable right away. So the only way I could watch like WTBS, those types of things, was to go over to my grandparents in New Smyrna Beach, and everybody be eating dinner, and I'd be back in their bedroom with the TV set on watching wrestling. Where's John Edward? I think he's in the back watching wrestling. So
I love it. Yeah, I the only family member I really had that liked wrestling was my aunt. And so she got to take me to a couple of shows back in the day. So I was fortunate enough to get to see like Andre and the Ultimate Warrior and, Dusty and Macho Man wrestle. And matter of fact, the great story, like after when Dusty and Macho Man were both feuding in WWF, they basically the night, it was like Freedom Hall was where the show was. And right across the street was a Burger King. And so we went there to get something to eat after the show. And the drive-thru guy, they were all excited because a limo had just come through with a big order, and Macho Man and Dusty were both in the limo. And I mean, it just blew everybody's minds because, the wrestling fans, you're like, wait a minute, weren't they just fighting something like that? What are they doing in the same car together?
Don't let Vince know. Yeah, don't let Vince know.
Yeah. So they were all excited about that. And it just kind of blew my mind. It's like, wait a minute. So that's kayfabe started breaking just right then for me at that moment. So
That's funny. That's funny. Well, kind of with mine, with seeing them live, we didn't get a lot of live shows in my town. Obviously, we weren't part of the general stopping point for CWF. But Kevin Sullivan was from South Daytona, and I've had numerous conversations with him about this. He was my dad's an attorney, and he was a client of my father's. And a woman, Nancy Benoit, she was from my high school. She went to DeLand High School.
Oh, wow.
And that's when she was married to Kevin. So I remember being a kid and in my dad's office, and in walks Kevin Sullivan and the Prince of Darkness and woman. And I believed that's when I believed, wrestling was real to me at that point. I literally thought the devil was in to see my dad. And I've laughed at this. I've laughed with him about that. And multiple times I would run into Kevin at one time at a Steak and Shake, one time at a Japanese restaurant when he was with the Purple Haze and Oliver Humperdinck. They'd call me over they called me over once to have sushi with them. And it was like, I laughed about it. I was like, I thought I was the coolest kid on the block. All the bad guys liked me, so it was, I love it.
That is fantastic. So, of course, your love of wrestling obviously kind of influenced you, to be, go into writing as a profession. What, show kind of, moved you into the genre of comic books? I know you've done both, some prose books, but what, moved you mostly into comic books?
Well, I started with comics, and what happened was I've got a daughter she's 23 now, but at the time she was much younger, and we would go to comic book conventions together. And one of the things that always, kind of bothered me was that it seemed like, and this gets off the wrestling a little bit, all the female characters to me were over-sexualized, and being the father of a young teenage daughter, I didn't necessarily want all, the female characters that she looked up to always be portrayed this way. But I've been a firm believer that if you don't like something, change it. So I created my first comic. It was called Rochelle the Teen Cockroach, and it was kind of on a whim just for her. And I sent it off. It got published by AC Comics, which is a small publisher I think they're out of Apopka, just outside of Orlando. And after it did that, it did really well with them, and it got picked up by Antarctic Press. And we ended up doing two 3-issue runs with them. And that's really what broke me into comics. It did really well, got picked up on a lot of sites as a top new independent comic. It got into all the comic stores, went through Diamond. And then that's what led into the wrestling, because as you know, I'd always been a fan of professional wrestling, and a friend of mine who was also a wrestling fan got my Rochelle book in the hands of Nikolai Volkov.
Oh, wow.
And that's when I kind of realized that a lot of wrestlers are also into comics, and they're into toys, and they're into all these things. And of course, I've learned that more as I've become friends with a lot of these guys.
Sure, yeah.
But I ended up getting a message from Nikolai, and he said, I've always wanted someone to tell my story in a comic. And people promise me, but, they always disappear after we talk about it. And I said, well, Nikolai, I promise you, if I tell you I'm going to get something done, I'm going to get something done. So I connected with the artist on my Rochelle book, a guy named Del Barris, and we put the book together. And then I had done some research through Kickstarter and found a publisher out of Alabama called Inverse Press. It's owned by a couple, Kevin Laporte and Amanda Rachel. Mm-hmm. And I reached out to them, and they're big wrestling fans. They grew up, outside of Dothan, Alabama, where there's been a lot of wrestling in Dothan. Oh yeah. And I said something to them, and they said, absolutely, let's do it. And they created an imprint for their publishing company called Squared Circle Comics, and that's kind of what led to what we're doing. So Nikolai kind of kicked it off with Squared Circle, and then it's just kind of grown from there.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you've covered, Hollywood from Glow Wrestling, the Killer Bees, which, of course, one of my favorite tag teams from back in the day. Yeah. And of course, Bruno Sammartino, the Fantastics, the Rock and Roll Express. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Oh, gosh, Rocky Johnson. We've got Jake Hager. We've got one of your guys, Lanny Poffo. We did the Geniuses book. Hacksaw Jim Duggins. We're wrapping up his series here pretty soon. So we've really put some really great books out. And what we do is we're not telling comics as you would maybe think. We're doing them in biographical form. So what I would do is I would sit down and I interview these wrestlers, and I get their life story. And I try and tell, their background, how they got into wrestling, and then try and hit the highlights of their wrestling career, but stay kayfabe on the matches, because I loved wrestling. So I don't want to go in and say, oh, we sat in the back and we talked out how no, we don't do that. We treat the matches as though it's a real match, but we're giving you their life up to that point. So that's what we try and do.
And that's why I thought was a very unique point, for your writing as well, is that, you do stay kayfabe. So that's, a lot of times people want to, pull the curtain back, but I like that fact.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, reading, Bruno Sammartino's story, I mean, his life growing up was almost more interesting than his life in the ring.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And for those who don't know, I mean, Bruno, first of all, he almost didn't even live past the age of 10.
Right.
At one point in his life, he'd been lined up against a wall by Nazi soldiers with his mother and his siblings with a machine gun pointed at him. And if it weren't for a couple of local villagers showing up at the last moment to take those Nazi soldiers out, he wouldn't have been there.
Right.
And then he's a guy, he couldn't pass his physical to immigrate from Italy into the United States because he was so malnourished. He actually lived in the mountains in a small village that they'd created in the mountains. And he went from not being able to pass his physical to holding the world record in the bench press. I mean, imagine that. I mean, he was, amazing. He was known as the Pittsburgh Strongman.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you read issue 2, but his first match was against an orangutan.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love this.
What an amazing life this guy led, and he was such a nice guy. I mean, I was introduced to him by Nikolai, actually.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, he was a mentor to Nikolai. When Nikolai actually did defect to the United States.
Yeah.
He wasn't a Russian. He was from Croatia, but he did defect to the United States and to Canada initially, where he went and trained in the dungeon with Stu Hart.
Yeah.
And eventually he met Bruno, and Nikolai spoke Italian. So it was easy for him to communicate because Bruno could talk to him in Italian and do all the translating for him until he came up to par on his English. So they became very tight. It was almost like a big brother, little brother kind of relationship that they had.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Of course, I've always, as a comic book fan, I appreciate the fact that Bruno's inspiration to get the physique he had was the Charles Atlas program. Of course, comic books growing up, you'd see those Charles Atlas ads all the time.
Absolutely. Well, and Bruno, if you read his comic, Bruno, they were not wealthy.
Right.
He and his brother, they would ask his mom for money for weights, and she didn't have the money. So eventually they got jobs as teenagers working construction jobs. And they literally saved their money over months to raise, I think it was $20 to buy the Atlas workout book. And they just did their initial workouts doing push-ups and such in their house,
right?
And things like that. So I mean, it's not like he had the equipment and things that these guys have today. He was really just a hard worker, and that busted it. He really was the American dream, an immigrant who worked his way from the ground up to become, the longest reigning world champion in the history of the WWF or WWE.
Yeah, that's still, a record that's absolutely fascinating because there's the length he had. Of course, the business was a lot different back then.
The business was different. And honestly, I think it's a record that you'll never see broken. I can't see any organization holding, I think it was a total of 10 years. I can't see any organization keeping a belt on somebody for 10 years.
No, I mean, there's most organizations these days don't last that long.
No. And part of it was, he was, at the time, the Italian community was big, and first of all in Canada, because that's where he was a champion in Canada initially, because he had a falling out with Vince Sr. And when he eventually came back, that Italian community in New York was huge. That's why they were able to sell out the Garden so much, because it was his people getting behind him. He was
a homeboy.
Yeah, he was like a wrestling Rocky. It's basically what he was. Rocky Balboa in a wrestling ring.
Of course, I mentioned earlier you did, bio comics on the Killer Bees as well, and I like too that you kind of broke up the issues, like B. Brian Blair and Jim Brunzell get their own issues, separately, because they did have their own separate, singles careers, and then they were put together in the WWE as the Killer Bees. Yeah,
and that's a format I've tried to use with the tag team matches and tag team wrestlers. I mean, because each, like you said, each of these guys, for the most part. Not them in particular, but most tag teams, these people have individual careers either as single wrestlers or as tag team wrestlers. And for me, I followed Brian Blair. I remember Brian grew up in Tampa.
Yeah.
So I remember Brian working his way through championship wrestling from Florida. And he was Florida champion. He was the Southern champion. He was a singles guy. Other than some tag team work he did with Steve Kern. And then you had Jumpin' Jim Brunzell, who I'm a big Washington Redskins fan. He was a Washington Redskins tight end.
Yeah.
Who eventually was part of the High Flyers with Greg Gagne, which is arguably one of the top 20 tag teams in the history of the business.
Absolutely.
They were great in the AWF. So before he even hit the WWF with Brian, he'd been one hell of a great tag team. And I think some people have argued, at least he did, the highest drop kick in the history of wrestling.
Yeah, I would certainly say so.
Well, he was a Minnesota high school high jump champion.
Wow.
State champion. So, he had that background as well. So really, really interesting stuff.
Yeah. And of course, it's interesting too that Brunzell was basically part of like two groundbreaking tag teams, because at the time when the Bees were put together in the WWF, at the time, then WWF, there, you had individuals high flying. You had your Snuka, and I think Coco Beware may have just started coming in, but you definitely didn't have two guys in a tag team at the same time like that.
That way.
Of course, they had their mask gimmick that they would do, which borrows a little bit from luchador wrestling, but that's a heel gimmick.
It was a heel gimmick, and it worked. They were able to pull that off, that whole switcheroo, which I can't think of another face team that ever pulled anything off like that before. But
you would you would definitely get like a lot of like twin teams, male and female, that would do that from time to time. But yeah, you're right. They were always heels. You never had a face that would basically pull some heel tactics and still be, they'd get away with it.
Now it's common. Now you can't find a match that doesn't have it. But back then that was groundbreaking. And I think even the way they created their team was so interesting. For those who don't know, the whole idea of the Killer Bees, they were fans of the Miami Dolphins. Yeah. And the Miami Dolphins Killer Bees defense is how they got the name of their team. And I don't know if you saw, I don't know if you read, I'm sure you did read that first issue. Their first trunks just so happened that, and it was neat how this worked because I was doing all of their comics simultaneously, that Lanny Poffo happened to have a pair of yellow and black striped trunks in his bag when they decided to create the team as the Killer Bees. Yeah. And he tossed them over to him. He goes, "Here you go. Here's your trunks, guys." And that's how they ended up with the black and yellow striped trunks. Lanny just happened to have a pair in his gym bag. So kind of a.
Of course. I love it. They named it after the defense, but of course, with their names, ending in B, it worked on several different levels.
Absolutely. Which is similar to the Rock and Roll Express. Originally they were going to be the R&R Express for Robert and Ricky, and but they were all trying to do that rock and roll gimmick. It matched, both of them matched. Just a very creative, a lot of creativity back in those days.
Yeah, and of course I can't imagine Ricky and Robert not being together. I mean, they've been such a long-standing tag team. It's like, did they ever have a singles career whatsoever, or is were they just born on the same day? I mean, what's going on?
Well, yeah, but honestly, kind of hearkening back to what we were talking about with the Killer Bees, Robert had a brother named Ricky, the Gibson brothers, and they had one hell of a team together. Sadly, his brother passed away, but Robert and Ricky the other Ricky had a really good tag team for a while, and Ricky Morton himself was a very good singles wrestler. Ricky wrestled. I can't remember how many times he wrestled Ric Flair for the world title.
Right.
But Ricky had a very solid singles career. So it was almost like Ricky was kind of like the Brian Blair in that situation, whereas Robert was more of a Jumpin' Jim Brunzell type situation there. So just a really neat pairing that they put together.
Absolutely. And of course, I going back once more to the Bees, they of course were part of the infamous Global Wrestling Federation. They're short-lived there, and it was their tag team champions at one point too.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and we touch on that in the book as well. And then it's so neat to look at those and then see all the different teams that you might have seen in the WWE, how they all tie in. A lot of them were part of the UWF, like the Barbarian, the Warlord, and all those guys tie back into. They were bumping around through all those different territories at the time. So a lot of guys that you might have seen come into the WWE or WWF at the time, you didn't hear of them, but they'd been in the business for years. They'd been out in California, or they'd been out, in the AWA in Minnesota, or they'd been down in Florida or in Alabama, or multiple territories, Charlotte and places like those. And, Vince was bringing them in and a lot of times rebranding them. So,
yeah. So, of course, you've got a couple of upcoming projects here. One I'm very excited about here, a gentleman who has had quite an interesting wrestling career, reinventing himself too, which is a very difficult thing to do. But the Funker himself, Terry Funk, we got to talk about that.
Yeah, so at the end of July, we're going to be doing a Kickstarter for Terry Funk. We're actually doing it in two issues, because he's had quite a career. It'd be basically impossible to tell his whole story in one comic. But we've been working on this. I've been working on this with Terry now for a couple of years. The artist, we got an excellent artist out of Italy. You'll be amazed at some of the art. Yeah, but I sat down and I did some phone interviews with Terry. We got this great story. I have to admit, Terry was my favorite wrestler growing up as a kid. Even though he was a heel, I remember him coming into Florida. I remember him when he hit the WWE. I followed him everywhere he went. So it's really been an honor to work with him on it. Nice thing he's done too is he actually signed a collection of cards for us that we're going to make available to people who want to, back the comic if they want to get a little memorabilia to go with it. So we do have some signed cards, and he's also agreed to sign, between 15 and 20 comics that we'll make available on the Kickstarter as well. So it's nice if you're a fan of Terry Funk and a fan of his work and a fan of wrestling, some really cool things that, some of the backers can pick up before, we take it on the regular issue to go out. So there'll be some special things available.
Awesome. And of course, one other project you've got coming up here, going back to tag teams again. You've got a Bushwhackers biography coming out too.
Yeah, and that's a special for me. This is actually my first non comic book biography that I've done. It's interesting. I was approached a few years ago, probably about 3 years ago, by Bugsy McGraw. Bugsy's a close friend, and he's here in Florida as well, about writing or helping him write his book. And I kind of had a little trepidation because I'd never written a book. I've written comic books, but, the whole idea is a little different. It goes from doing like a, 24-page script to doing a 350-page book. It's a lot different, a little intimidating. So, I passed the project on to another friend who did an excellent job, Ian Douglas. He did an excellent job on that book, by the way. But then I had Bushwhacker Luke approach me with the same question, not knowing that I'd already turned down Bugsy. And I had my regrets for turning down Bugsy, I'll be honest with you. Yeah. So when Luke offered it, we were heading into COVID lockdowns. And so I knew I was kind of slowing down what I was doing on the comic side a little bit. So I said, what the hell, let's do it. So for about a year, every Wednesday night, like we're doing right now, I would get on a chat similar to this, WhatsApp, I think it was. So I'm not advertising for WhatsApp, but maybe but we'd get on that site, and I would bring in Butch from Wellington, New Zealand. Yeah. And I'd have Luke in from down around the Clearwater area, and then me. It'd be the three of us chatting on here for about 2.5 hours every Wednesday night with a little recorder going. And then the next day I'd go to my office and I'd transcribe all this stuff. And over that time, we put together, it's about a 355-page book that tracks their careers from the beginning, all the way back to New Zealand. Starting when Luke was 17, actually even before he was 17, because we go all the way back to when he was playing rugby and such. So we track all the way through actually their Hall of Fame appearance. So it's really a good book. It has a lot of stories that you probably haven't heard, some that you may have heard before, but we've tried to go in and really hit the highlights of their career, the different people who had influence in their lives. We've got some great photos. We got two forwards, one written by Hulk Hogan, the other written by Bret Hart. We've got an afterword written by George Napolitano. We've got a lot of input from everybody from Terry Funk to Hacksaw Jim Duggan to Rip Rogers to Steve Kern. All these guys contributed a little bit to the book. That we've got their little blurbs throughout. So it's really, I'm really excited to get this out here. I know Luke is as well. The only thing we're waiting on right now is our cover artist is finishing up, kind of formatting with the title and such. And my hope is to get that out there within the month. Yeah, we'll probably do a quick Kickstarter again,
Mm-hmm.
and offer some Kickstarter exclusive covers that'll help us fund ordering a bunch of copies of the book, basically, is what that's for. But those people can get some early editions with a limited edition cover. We're going to have signed copies available. And then we'll make the book available on Amazon. So you'll be able to order it, print to order through Amazon. And of course, anywhere you'll see me or see Luke or see Butch, we'll have books. And I was talking to a promoter the other day, and it seems as though they're going to try and bring Butch in next year. So hopefully we'll get a little tour doing where we can take the books out and try and see everybody. Everybody can meet them, get some signed books, get some pictures. Should be a lot of fun.
That would be wonderful. Yeah. So, of course, I mean, personally, I love listening to wrestler stories from basically just, back in the, behind the scenes stories or just on the road stuff or whatever else. Of course, you said before you like to keep things kayfabe. Is there ever like a story that you really wanted to share in a certain biography that you couldn't or just wanted to keep because of your rules on it, or how did that go?
Yeah, I mean, we've got some. I mean, I try and whenever I talk to these guys, I do explain to them I don't want to put any kind of story in there that's going to disparage someone else.
Right.
And obviously if you're on the road and you're working with people like these guys did, for instance, you talk about Luke and Bush, 50 plus years, you're not always going to get along with everyone.
Sure.
But we try and keep the negativity out of the book, or if something is said, we just don't mention names, those types of things. So there are some, you'll see some in there where you might see a name that's not mentioned and you'll wonder, well, I wonder who the hell that was. And you'll try and do some research and figure out who the hell they're talking about. But obviously that does have it come to play. The comics, I restrict it quite a bit because we don't have as many pages to work with.
Sure.
So again, I stay away from the negativity. No negative stuff. We try and stay away from any X-rated stories. As a lot of X-rated things happened on the road back in those days. Eventually, like you'll read in the Bushwhacker book, eventually Vince did put his foot down. He said this stuff has got to calm down. I think there was worry about lawsuits and things like that. With some of the stuff, not necessarily with the Bushwhackers, but just in general. Sure. So eventually they did have to put their foot down as an organization, which you'd be surprised seeing the news nowadays. But, so yeah, some of that stuff, I don't put those kind of things in the comics. We're trying to tell the good stuff. I mean, some guys had some rough parts in their life. Like if you read Gangrel's comic, he had some rough spots growing up. He had his little brother was drowned when he was a child, and it put him through some rough periods of his life. And obviously we talk about that because we talk about how wrestling pulled him out of and put him where he is now, which is a successful career in wrestling. And I see he has more of he's a coach now, and he's back in the AEW. So he's got students hitting in AEW. He's back in AEW, and wrestling really, I think, pulled him out of the doldrums. So it's done some good stuff for people too.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, I mean, his whole relationship with Luna Vachon too.
Oh, absolutely.
And her death was certainly had an effect on him as well. So
absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
So has there ever been a subject who is either proven elusive that you want to do a bio on them, but they have either turned you down, or someone you just haven't asked yet, like a dream yet?
I'm trying to think. I honestly, no, I can't think of any who've actually really turned us down. I mean, at this point, and I'm not saying this to puff us up or anything, but at this point, generally they're reaching out to us to do their books now.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I mean, we're booked out. We are booked out, I would say, at least until around 2024 or 2025.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, some of the upcoming projects I can mention because we've already signed them and announced, but like Dan Severn, the Warlord, the family of Road Warrior Animal, family of King Kong Bundy, the family of Mean Gene Okerlund. We've got Billy Gunn. So we've got a lot that we haven't even gotten to yet.
That's amazing.
And if you know the comics genre, it's not like you can write a comic and then boom, it's out the next week.
Sure.
It takes me doing an interview. I have to prepare a script. The wrestlers have to approve the script. We have to send it to an editor. Then we have to have an artist get to work on it. And then we have to have a colorist. And then we have to have a letterer. And then we've got to run the Kickstarter. So it's not a quick process. It's a long drawn out process. So when you have a lot of them that you're working on, and we still need to finish the series for Rock and Roll Express and for Bruno and for Hacksaw. So, I did just finish the third and last issue for Rock and Roll. So that one's in the pipe to be coming out following the Funk book. So.
Oh, fantastic. Of course, aside from doing wrestling books, you have, moved into other genres as well. A certainly soft spot in my heart. You worked on Heavy Metal Magazine, which, that's amazing right then and there, because I grew up on that one for sure.
Yeah, me too. I have to say that was kind of my holy grail. As I mentioned before, I actually broke into the industry with AC Comics with the Rochelle book that eventually was published by Antarctic Press. And I continue to work with Antarctic. I've done stories for their horror comic series. I've got books currently coming out in both Planet Comics and what's the other one? Jungle Comics.
Okay.
I created the Blackjack character for their Exciting Comics series. Mm-hmm. I've done work with numerous independent publishers. I've got the Teen Beetle series, which is loosely based off of the Blue Beetle. The artist with me on that actually was one of the artists on the original Blue Beetle for DC.
Okay.
And we're not the original, but DC's version of it. And that's coming out on Kickstarter from Silverline Comics. But right after I finished working with horror comics, one of the artists that I'd worked with, we put a story out, which is a big plus for me. I've held the contract. So we signed a contract with Kevin Eastman and did some work when he was with Heavy Metal. And we made the first one being in the Christmas holiday issue from 2020. So that was a holy grail for me. I mean, I grew up with Heavy Metal, and people have asked when I thought I reached the pinnacle of where I wanted to go in comics. And I said, honestly, once I hit Heavy Metal, I kind of felt like I'd kind of got there. I kind of got there, and that's really why I've kind of leaned now. I'm hoping I'll continue with the comics.
Sure.
I continue with the comics, but I am going to try and do a lot more of these prose biographies, like I'm doing for the Bushwhackers. I find that enjoyable. You really get to know the guys well, because it's a long period. It's a long process.
Sure.
And I'm talking with 2 or 3 different individuals who are hoping I'll step in and take care of their books for them too. So I think we've got a nice pipeline going in that direction as well.
Fantastic. I love hearing about it all. So, before we let you go here, we definitely want to plug all your websites here and all your social media. So on Facebook and on Instagram, you're at John Crowther.
Yeah.
And Johnny E. Crowther here on Instagram. And then Twitter, Crowmans1971.
Yeah.
And then, of course, your webpage or your Tumblr here, johncrowthercomics.tumblr.com.
Yeah.
I
tell people I try my best to update all these sites, but at my age, I'm still trying to remember all these social media sites. So you can, but feel free to follow me or send me a friend request on Facebook. I've also got a John E. Crowther comic book writer page. I think I'm filled up with friends right now on Facebook. So, I post everything over on the writer page as well. If you're in the Central Florida area or even in the Georgia area, some shows you'll be able to catch me at coming up. Let's see, I'll be at Savannah Comic Con up in Savannah, Georgia on July 30th and 31st. I'm trying to think what we've got. I know in November I've got a couple of them. I've got one out in Lake County Comic Con I just announced. I think it's on the 20th. We got a Sci-Fi Pop Con and also in that month, I think in September, I've got Daytona Beach Comic Con. January, I've got DeLand Comic Con. So you can find me usually throughout Central Florida. But also I'm trying to delve a little bit up into Georgia. I love the town of Savannah. So my wife and I are going to make a nice little vacation out of it.
Wonderful. You are a busy guy, man. I'll tell you what. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on Fanatic Forum. I really appreciate you. It's just great hearing about all your projects and everything like that. It's very exciting.
Thanks. I really appreciate you having me on. I've enjoyed it, and have me back anytime. Honestly, once we get that Bushwhacker book out, maybe we can sneak Luke in here with us or something.
That'd be a dream.
I'm sure. Honestly, I'm sure we could make it happen once we get that book out. I'm sure he'd be happy to come on.
Excellent. There you go. You heard it here, folks. So we might actually have a Bushwhacker here on the
floor. And I'll try for 2. We'll see if we can get, depending on the time, we might be able to get Butch in here too.
Oh, that'd be fantastic here. Well, thank you, Johnny. I will let you go here. You have a good one here.
Yeah. Have a good night.
All right.